My phone rang at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, jolting me awake from my couch where I dozed off watching late-night television. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in 3 years, and my stomach dropped when I recognized my father's voice on the other end. He sounded older, weaker, almost fragile, as he explained through trembling words that he and my mother were in serious financial trouble and desperately needed someone to care for them. They were offering me $25,000 in exchange for moving back home and helping with their mounting medical bills and daily needs. The bitter irony hit me immediately, like a punch to the gut. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, Iowa, my childhood hometown that I'd left behind 7 years ago with no intention of returning. The conversation with my father kept replaying in my mind, each word carrying the weight of decades of disappointment and neglect. Frank had always been a man of few words, but last night his voice carried a desperation I'd never heard before, a vulnerability that made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. As I turned onto Maple Street, expecting to see the 2-story colonial house where I'd grown up, my breath caught in my throat. The house was gone. In its place stood a newer construction with different landscaping and a completely unfamiliar car in the driveway. Confused, I pulled over and checked the address my father had given me, realizing it led to the Pine Valley Mobile Home Park on the outskirts of town. The contrast couldn't have been more shocking. Where I remembered manicured lawns and tree-lined streets, I now found myself driving through a collection of weathered trailers and patched driveways. My parents' address led me to a small beige mobile home with peeling paint around the windows and a sagging front step that looked like it might collapse under any significant weight. My mother, Carol, answered the door, and the sight of her nearly broke my heart. At 72, she looked far older than I remembered, moving slowly with the help of an aluminum walker. Her once proud posture had given way to a hunched frame, and her silver hair was thinner, pulled back in a simple ponytail that emphasized the deep lines around her eyes. Behind her, I could see my father Frank sitting in a torn brown recliner, his 75-year-old frame looking smaller and more fragile than the strong factory supervisor I remembered from my childhood. "Gunner," Carol whispered, her voice breaking as she reached out to touch my face with shaking fingers. "You came. I wasn't sure you would after everything." The interior of the mobile home was cramped and cluttered with furniture that I recognized from our old house pieces that had once fit comfortably in larger rooms, now squeezed together in a space no bigger than our old living room. Stacks of unopened mail covered the small kitchen table, and I could see medical bills and past due notices mixed among them. The refrigerator hummed loudly, and I noticed it was nearly empty when Carol opened it to offer me something to drink. Frank struggled to stand as I approached, his movements slow and deliberate. Diabetes had taken its toll over the years, and I could see the telltale signs of someone managing a chronic illness without adequate medical care. His insulin supplies were rationed in small containers on a TV tray beside his chair, and I noticed he was using a glucose meter that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Son," he said, simply extending his hand for a shake that felt weaker than I expected. "Thank you for coming. I know this is difficult." As I settled into the only other chair in the small living area, the memories came flooding back with painful clarity. This was so different from the childhood I remembered when Jessica was the center of our universe, and every family decision revolved around her needs and ambitions. My sister, now 32, had been the golden child from the moment she could walk, displaying natural athletic ability and academic excellence that earned her constant praise and unlimited financial support. I remembered being 14 years old, working weekend jobs at the local auto parts store, while Jessica received full funding for elite soccer camps that cost more than my annual school expenses. When other kids my age were playing video games or hanging out with friends, I was learning to change oil and replace brake pads, developing the mechanical skills that would eventually become my career as an automotive technician. For Jessica's 16th birthday, our parents had surprised her with a brand new Honda Civic, complete with a red bow in the driveway, and a celebration party that included half her high school class. 6 months later, when I turned 16, Frank handed me the keys to his rusted pickup truck with a broken transmission and told me it would be good experience to learn how to fix it myself. Every family photo from those years told the same story. Jessica's soccer trophies dominated our mantelpiece. Her honor roll certificates covered the refrigerator, and her college acceptance letters were framed and displayed in the hallway. My steady work ethic, reliable grades, and natural problem-solving abilities went largely unnoticed, overshadowed by Jessica's more glamorous achievements. The silence in the small trailer was broken by Martha, an elderly neighbor from the adjacent mobile home, who knocked gently on the door. Carol introduced her as someone who had been helping them with grocery shopping and medication pickups, a kindness that highlighted just how isolated my parents had become. "Your folks are good people," Martha said quietly as she handed Carol a bag of groceries. "They've been struggling, but they're too proud to ask for help from anyone except family." After Martha left, the full scope of my parents' situation began to emerge. Frank explained that they'd been forced to sell the family home 6 months earlier when their adjustable rate mortgage reset to a payment they couldn't afford on their combined Social Security income. The house that had been in our family for 30 years, where Jessica and I had grown up, was gone forever. They'd been living off the proceeds from the house sale, but Frank's insulin costs and Carol's physical therapy sessions for her arthritis were draining their resources faster than they'd anticipated. Medicare covered only a portion of their expenses, and the gap between their fixed income and their medical needs was growing wider each month. "We've got 30 days before they evict us from here, too," Frank admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The rent went up, and we're already 2 months behind. I didn't know who else to call." The weight of their desperation settled over me like a heavy blanket. These were the same people who had given my sister everything without question, who had prioritized her comfort and success over basic fairness or financial planning. Now they were living in a mobile home, rationing medication, and facing homelessness while the daughter they'd favored had disappeared from their lives completely. That night I lay on their narrow couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mobile home park. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked continuously, and the thin walls allowed me to hear every movement from the neighboring trailers. This wasn't how I'd imagined my parents would spend their golden years, and despite everything that had happened between us, seeing them in such desperate circumstances stirred emotions I wasn't prepared to face. I woke up to the sound of my mother shuffling around the kitchen trying to prepare coffee, with hands that shook from both age and stress. The morning light streaming through the small windows revealed details I'd missed in the emotional haze of the previous evening. Water stains marked the ceiling in several places, and the carpet showed years of wear that spoke to the temporary nature of their current living situation. "I'll stay for a week," I told them over breakfast, which consisted of generic cereal and milk that was close to its expiration date. "Let me see what the situation really looks like, and we'll figure out what options you have." Frank nodded gratefully, but I could see the shame in his eyes. This man had worked for 30 years as a factory supervisor, managing dozens of employees and maintaining complex industrial equipment. He'd been respected in our community, known for his reliability and strong work ethic. Seeing him reduced to accepting charity from the son he'd overlooked for decades was clearly devastating to his pride. While my parents rested that afternoon, I began sorting through boxes of financial documents that had been hastily packed when they moved from the house. What I discovered in those papers changed everything I thought I knew about Jessica's inheritance and our family's financial situation. Hidden beneath mortgage statements and insurance policies, I found bank records that told a story far more devastating than I'd imagined. The inheritance Jessica had received wasn't just the proceeds from some small investment account or a modest gift for her 25th birthday. It was the entirety of my parents' life savings, carefully accumulated over decades of hard work and sacrifice. Frank had spent 30 years contributing to a pension fund and a company 401k plan while Carol had worked as a school secretary for 25 years, diligently saving every spare dollar for their retirement. Together, they'd managed to accumulate $430,000 in various accounts, money that represented their security for the future and their ability to age with dignity. According to the paperwork, they'd liquidated everything when Jessica turned 25 3 years ago. Pension funds, retirement accounts, certificates of deposit, even the small investment portfolio Frank had been building since the 1980s. All of it had been converted to cash and handed over to Jessica with no legal protections, no trust fund restrictions, and apparently no serious conversation about the responsibility that came with such a massive financial gift. But the revelation that truly shattered my understanding of the situation was hidden in a folder marked Property Records. My parents hadn't just given Jessica their savings. They'd also taken out a reverse mortgage on the family home to pay for her graduate school in communications, a program that cost $60,000 over 2 years and which Jessica never completed. I sat in stunned silence as the implications became clear. My parents had literally mortgaged their future to fund Jessica's lifestyle, believing that their sacrifice would somehow benefit the entire family in the long run. They'd assumed that Jessica would use her education and the inheritance to build a successful career that would allow her to care for them as they aged. Carol found me sitting at the small kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents, tears streaming down my face as I processed the magnitude of their sacrifice and Jessica's betrayal. She sat down across from me, her own eyes filling with tears as she realized what I'd discovered. "She was supposed to be our insurance policy," Carol whispered, her voice breaking. "We thought if we gave her everything, she'd always be there for us. Frank worked double shifts for 5 years to build up that savings account. I took on extra work during summers and saved every penny from my school secretary job." The phone records I found painted an even more heartbreaking picture. Jessica had called them exactly 3 times after receiving the inheritance. The first call was to confirm the money had been deposited in her account. The second was to inform them she was moving to Nashville with someone named Derek and wouldn't be returning to Iowa anytime soon. The third and final call had come 8 months after she'd received the inheritance. According to the notes Carol had written on a piece of paper beside the phone, Jessica had screamed at them for nearly 20 minutes, blaming them for her financial troubles and claiming that their unconditional love had made her too trusting and vulnerable to manipulation. She said we'd failed as parents because we didn't teach her about money management. Carol explained, her voice hollow with remembered pain. She told us that Derek had convinced her to invest in his music production company, and when it failed, she said it was our fault for raising her to believe that people could be trusted. Frank had written down some of Jessica's exact words from that final conversation, and reading them made my blood boil. She'd accused them of being naive old people who lived in a fantasy world where hard work and honesty meant something. She'd claimed that losing the inheritance was a valuable life lesson that they should have taught her earlier, making her financial ruin somehow their responsibility, rather than her own poor judgment. But the detail that broke my heart completely was Carol's note about the conversation's ending. Jessica had hung up by telling them that she was done being their daughter and that they shouldn't expect to hear from her again unless they had more money to offer. That conversation had taken place 2.5 years ago, and they hadn't spoken to her since. Through internet searches that evening, I began to piece together Derek's identity and background. Derek Chen, as he called himself online, presented himself as a struggling musician and entrepreneur who was always on the verge of his next big breakthrough. His social media profiles showed a carefully crafted image of artistic sensitivity, combined with business ambition, exactly the type of persona that would appeal to someone like Jessica. But deeper searches revealed troubling inconsistencies in his story. The music production company he'd convinced Jessica to invest in had no legitimate business registration, no physical address, and no other employees besides Derek himself. His previous relationships, which I could track through social media posts and public records, all seemed to follow a similar pattern of intense romantic pursuit, followed by financial exploitation and sudden disappearance. Martha stopped by that evening to check on my parents and found me still researching Derek's background on my laptop. She sat down beside me and shared her own observations about my parents' decline over the past year. They cried for weeks after Jessica's last phone call, Martha told me quietly. Your father would sit outside in the morning with his coffee just staring at nothing. Your mother stopped going to her book club, stopped talking to her old neighbors from the house. They were so ashamed of what happened, they didn't want anyone to know how Jessica had treated them. She explained that my parents had been too proud to ask for help from their old friends or extended family members. They'd cut themselves off from their support network rather than admit that their favoritism had backfired so catastrophically. Instead of aging gracefully in the home they'd worked so hard to buy, they'd become isolated and financially desperate, clinging to hope that either Jessica would return or that their other son might somehow forgive decades of neglect. As I prepared for bed that second night, the full scope of the situation settled over me like a weight I wasn't sure I could carry. My parents had sacrificed everything for a daughter who'd taken their generosity and thrown it away on a man who'd manipulated and abandoned her. Now they were facing their final years in poverty and uncertainty, while Jessica had disappeared into whatever life she'd built from the ashes of their inheritance. But something else was becoming clear to me as I processed everything I'd learned. This wasn't just about money or inheritance or even family favoritism. This was about the fundamental questions of loyalty, responsibility, and what we owe to the people who raised us. Jessica had been given every advantage, every opportunity, and every resource our family could provide. In return, she'd shown them that love could be conditional and that family bonds could be severed when convenience required it. The question that kept me awake that night was whether I was prepared to step into the role Jessica had abandoned, and whether doing so would make me complicit in the same dysfunctional family dynamics that had created this crisis in the first place. The pounding on the trailer door came at 2:15 in the morning, startling me from the restless sleep I'd finally managed on the narrow couch. Through the thin walls, I could hear my father's confused voice asking who would be visiting at such an hour, followed by my mother's sharp intake of breath as she recognized something in the desperate quality of the knocking. I reached the door first, peering through the peephole to see a figure hunched against the cold March wind. When I opened the door, my sister Jessica stood on the rickety front steps, and the transformation from the confident, beautiful woman I remembered was so complete that for a moment I didn't recognize her. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly prominent beneath a threadbare coat that hung loose on her otherwise diminished frame. Her once lustrous blonde hair, which had graced the covers of our college alumni magazine during her modeling days, was now stringy and unwashed, pulled back in a messy ponytail that emphasized how gaunt her face had become. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and I could see the telltale signs of weight loss, despite her pregnancy giving her an almost skeletal appearance that was deeply disturbing. "Please," she whispered, clutching a single backpack that appeared to contain all her worldly possessions. "I have nowhere else to go." Carol pushed past me, immediately wrapping her arms around Jessica, despite the shock of seeing her daughter in such condition. Frank struggled to get out of his recliner, his medical equipment forgotten, as he focused entirely on the child he'd favored for so many years. Whatever anger they'd carried about her previous abandonment seemed to evaporate in the face of her obvious distress. Inside the cramped trailer, Jessica's story emerged in fits and starts between tears and periods of near hysteria. She'd been living with Derek in a series of increasingly dangerous situations as his behavior became more erratic and violent. The music production company had been a complete fabrication existing only on paper, and in Derek's imagination designed purely to separate Jessica from her inheritance money. He started selling my things when the money ran low. Jessica explained, her voice barely audible as she described the systematic stripping away of everything valuable she'd owned. Her grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom worth several $1,000s, had been sold to pay Derek's gambling debts. Her college championship ring, the symbol of her athletic achievements, that had once been the pride of our entire family, had disappeared one night when Derek claimed he needed quick cash for business expenses. The pregnancy, she revealed, wasn't accidental. Derek had deliberately tampered with her birth control pills, believing that a baby would ensure continued financial support from her family. He'd researched our parents' background and calculated that grandparents would be unable to resist providing money for their grandchild's welfare, creating a permanent source of income he could manipulate. He showed me pictures. Jessica said, her voice breaking as she described Derek's threats. Pictures of what happens to people who cross the people he owes money to. He said I'd never see the baby alive if I tried to leave him, that his friends knew how to make people disappear without a trace. As she spoke, Jessica pulled out her phone to show us text messages from Derek's number. The messages contained photos of our parents' mobile home, taken from different angles and at different times of day, proving that Derek had been conducting surveillance on our family. The threats were explicit and detailed, describing exactly what he would do to each of us if Jessica tried to permanently escape his control. "He knows you're here, Gunner," Jessica said, looking directly at me with terror in her eyes. "He's been tracking my movements through my phone, and he knows about Mom and Dad's situation. He thinks you have money because you came back to help them, and he's planning to come for the baby once it's born." The implications of Derek's surveillance hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Jessica brought danger to our doorstep by returning, but Derek's threats extended to our elderly parents who were completely defenseless in their current situation. The mobile home offered no security, no protection from someone determined to cause harm, and the isolated location made it unlikely that neighbors would notice trouble until it was too late. Carol had been examining Jessica more closely while she spoke, and what she discovered added another layer of horror to the situation. Jessica's arms showed signs of healing bruises in the distinctive finger-shaped patterns that indicated forceful grabbing. Her wrists bore marks that suggested she'd been restrained, and her general malnourishment was even more shocking, given that she was supposed to be nourishing a developing baby. "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" Carol asked, her nursing instincts overriding her emotional response to Jessica's situation. "6 weeks ago," Jessica admitted. "Derek wouldn't let me go to appointments because he was afraid I'd tell someone what was happening. He said doctors were required to report certain things to authorities, and he couldn't risk any government involvement in our business." Frank had been listening to this conversation in growing fury, his face reddening as he processed the full scope of what Derek had done to his daughter. Despite decades of diabetes management, I could see his blood pressure rising as his protective instincts overcame his usual calm demeanor. "Oh, that monster used our money to set up this whole operation," Frank said through gritted teeth. "He researched our family, targeted Jessica specifically because he thought we had money, and now he's threatening to hurt our grandchild to keep the scam going." Jessica's breakdown intensified as she realized that Derek's manipulation had been even more calculated than she'd understood. She'd believed herself to be special to him, chosen for her beauty, or intelligence, or personal qualities. Learning that she'd been selected purely as a financial target, researched and pursued like a mark in an elaborate con game, shattered whatever self-respect she'd managed to maintain. But even in her desperate state, I could see flashes of the entitled thinking that had characterized Jessica throughout her life. When Carol offered her the small guest room that had been serving as a storage space, Jessica complained that the bed wasn't comfortable enough for someone in her condition. When Frank suggested she should contact the police immediately, she worried about how involving law enforcement might affect her reputation or future employment prospects. Most telling was her assumption that our family would automatically rally around her and solve the crisis she'd created. Despite abandoning our parents for 3 years and leaving them in financial ruin, she spoke as though their support was guaranteed, and their resources were naturally hers to command. The same patterns of thinking that had led her to squander her inheritance were still evident even in her moment of greatest vulnerability. As the night wore on, and Jessica finally fell asleep in the makeshift guest room, I sat with my parents in the small living area and tried to process the magnitude of what we were facing. Derek wasn't just a deadbeat boyfriend who'd stolen money and disappeared. He was a predator who'd built an entire criminal operation around exploiting women like Jessica, and he had the knowledge and connections to make his threats against our family a reality. The baby Jessica was carrying would be born in approximately 2 months, and Derek's pattern suggested he would intensify his pressure around that time. He'd calculated that grandparents would be most vulnerable to manipulation when an innocent child was involved, and he'd already demonstrated his willingness to use violence to maintain control over his victims. Frank and Carol were looking at me with expressions I'd never seen before, a combination of hope, desperation, and complete trust that somehow I would know how to handle a situation far beyond anything our small-town family had ever encountered. For the first time in my life, they were turning to me as the strong one, the problem solver, the son who could protect them when their golden child had brought danger to their doorstep. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica's return had finally created the circumstances where my parents valued my reliability and practical skills over her more glamorous achievements. But the satisfaction I might have felt at this reversal was overshadowed by the very real threats we were facing and the responsibility that had just landed squarely on my shoulders. I barely slept the rest of that night, my mind racing through possible solutions to protect my family from Derek's threats. By 6 in the morning, I'd made a decision that would either save us or put us in even greater danger. I was taking Jessica to the Cedar Falls Police Department to file a formal report regardless of her concerns about publicity or legal complications. Officer Timothy Bradley, a man in his mid-40s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd handled domestic violence cases for years, listened to Jessica's story with professional attention. But when she mentioned Derek's last name as Chen Officer, Bradley's expression changed dramatically. "Derek Chen," he asked, pulling up something on his computer screen. "Can you describe him physically?" Jessica provided details about Derek's appearance. 5 feet 10 inches tall, lean build, distinctive tattoo of a musical note behind his left ear, and a scar across his right knuckles from what he'd claimed was a childhood accident. Officer Bradley nodded grimly as each detail matched whatever information he was reviewing. "Miss, I need to transfer you to our federal liaison immediately. Derek Chen is already under investigation by the FBI for wire fraud and identity theft across multiple states. You're not his only victim, and this situation is much more serious than a simple domestic violence case." Within an hour, we were sitting across from FBI agent Sarah Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who specialized in romance fraud and financial crimes, targeting family inheritance money. What she revealed about Derek's operation turned my understanding of Jessica's situation completely upside down. Derek Thompson? Chen was just one of several false surnames he used, had been running an elaborate multi-state romance scam for over 4 years. His method was sophisticated and methodical, involving extensive social media research to identify women from wealthy families who'd recently received large inheritances or settlements. He'd developed multiple fake identities as struggling artists, entrepreneurs, or wounded veterans, tailoring his persona to match each victim's psychological profile and personal interests. "Your sister was victim number 7 that we know of," Agent Morrison explained, spreading photographs across the conference table. "He targets women between the ages of 22 and 35 who've recently come into significant money and who demonstrate certain personality characteristics that make them susceptible to his manipulation techniques. The photographs showed 6 other women, all bearing striking similarities to Jessica in terms of age, appearance, and social background. Each had been convinced to invest their inheritance or settlement money in Derek's fake business ventures, and each had been systematically isolated from their families through emotional manipulation and increasingly controlling behavior. But the detail that made my blood run cold was Agent Morrison's next revelation. 3 of Derek's previous victims were currently pregnant with his children, and he maintained control over all of them through a network of associates who conducted surveillance and delivered threats on his behalf. He times the pregnancies strategically, Agent Morrison continued. He gets the women pregnant when their money starts running low, knowing that grandparents and extended family members will be more likely to provide additional financial support when children are involved. It's a calculated long-term exploitation strategy. Jessica sat in stunned silence as Agent Morrison described how Derek had researched our family's financial situation months before approaching her. He'd identified our parents as small-town residents with substantial savings, Jessica as their favored child, who would likely inherit significant money, and even me as a potential backup source of financial support if needed. He knew about your automotive technician job, Gunner, Agent Morrison said, consulting her files. He'd calculated that if Jessica's initial inheritance ran out, her family would pool resources to support her and any children. Your steady employment and lack of dependence made you valuable to his long-term financial planning. The FBI had been tracking Derek for nearly 2 years following complaints from families across Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas. His operation was based out of a rural compound in Kentucky, where he lived with several male associates who helped him maintain surveillance on multiple victims and their families simultaneously. The compound was equipped with sophisticated communication equipment and weapons, suggesting that Derek's organization was far more dangerous than a simple romance scam. Agent Morrison showed us surveillance photographs of the Kentucky compound, a collection of mobile homes and outbuildings surrounded by high fencing and security cameras. Intelligence gathered through undercover operations suggested that Derek kept detailed files on all his victims, including photographs, financial records, and psychological profiles that helped him maximize the money he could extract from each situation. The other pregnant women are essentially prisoners, Agent Morrison explained. They live in separate trailers on the compound supervised by Derek's associates, and they're only allowed contact with their families when Derek needs to make financial demands. We believe he's planning to use the children as permanent leverage for ongoing extortion. Jessica's breakdown when she learned she was one of multiple victims was complete and devastating. Everything she'd believed about her relationship with Derek, that she was special to him, that their connection was genuine, that her pregnancy was the result of love rather than calculation, crumbled as she realized the extent to which she'd been manipulated and deceived. But Agent Morrison's most shocking revelation was still to come. Derek's criminal history included convictions for domestic violence and fraud in 2 other states, plus a dishonorable discharge from military service where he'd learned surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. He'd been working this type of scam for over a decade, refining his methods and expanding his operation with each successful victim. The pregnancy timing isn't accidental, Agent Morrison said, looking directly at Jessica. Based on our analysis of his pattern, he'll reappear demanding money approximately 2 weeks before your due date. He's calculated that's when family members are most emotionally vulnerable and most likely to pay whatever he demands to protect the baby. The FBI had been trying to locate Derek's compound for 6 months, but he changed locations frequently and used military-grade counter-surveillance equipment to avoid detection. They needed someone on the inside, someone Derek trusted to help them coordinate a successful arrest operation. He's been communicating with you through text messages, Agent Morrison noted. If you're willing to cooperate, we can use those communications to draw him into a controlled situation where we can take him into custody along with his associates. Jessica looked terrified at the prospect of actively participating in Derek's capture, but Agent Morrison explained that without her cooperation, Derek would simply continue his operation indefinitely. The other victims and their families would remain in danger, and our family would face ongoing threats until Derek decided we were no longer useful to his financial goals. The charges we can file against him include wire fraud, identity theft, extortion, kidnapping, and interstate transportation of stolen property, Agent Morrison said. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison, but we need evidence of ongoing criminal activity to make the charges stick. As we left the FBI office that afternoon, Jessica was quiet and withdrawn, overwhelmed by learning that her entire relationship with Derek had been a professional con operation designed to separate her from her inheritance. But I could see something else in her expression. A calculating look that suggested she was already thinking about how to use this information to her advantage. That evening, back in my parents' mobile home, Jessica made a comment that revealed her thinking hadn't fundamentally changed despite everything she'd learned about Derek's deception. "At least now I know it wasn't my fault," she said. "He was a professional criminal who would have fooled anyone. Mom and Dad can't blame me for being targeted by someone that's sophisticated." The statement revealed that even in the face of clear evidence about Derek's manipulation, Jessica was still looking for ways to avoid taking responsibility for her poor judgment and its consequences for our family. She was already constructing a narrative that positioned her as an innocent victim rather than someone who'd made terrible decisions that had devastated her family's financial security. Frank and Carol seemed relieved to learn that Derek was a professional criminal rather than simply a deadbeat boyfriend, as though his sophistication somehow excused Jessica's choices. But I could see that this situation was far from resolved, and that the patterns of thinking that had created our family crisis were still very much in play. The question that kept me awake that third night was whether Jessica had truly learned anything from this experience, or whether she would simply find new ways to rationalize her behavior and expect our family to bear the consequences of her decisions. While the FBI pursued their official investigation, I decided to conduct my own research using the practical problem-solving skills I'd developed during my automotive career. Years of diagnosing engine problems had taught me to look for patterns and connections that others might miss, and I suspected there were details about Derek's operation that law enforcement might overlook. I started by analyzing Derek's social media presence with the same methodical approach I used to troubleshoot complex mechanical issues. His Instagram and Facebook accounts showed a carefully constructed lifestyle designed to appeal to women like Jessica, but buried in the background details of his posts were clues about his actual location and activities. Cross-referencing the geographic markers embedded in his photos with automotive shop receipts I found among Jessica's belongings, I began to map Derek's movements over the past year. He'd been using Jessica's credit cards to purchase specific automotive parts and services, apparently maintaining several vehicles as part of his operation. The breakthrough came when I noticed that Derek had been using a particular type of prepaid phone service that required monthly registration with automotive parts suppliers for fleet discounts. This wasn't the kind of detail that would typically interest federal investigators, but my background in automotive logistics made the pattern obvious. By tracking these registrations through online databases accessible to automotive professionals, I was able to identify purchases made at shops in rural Kentucky that matched the time frame of Derek's disappearance. More importantly, the receipts showed he was maintaining multiple vehicles, suggesting a larger operation than even the FBI had realized. But my real discovery came when I decided to access Jessica's old email accounts to help Agent Morrison gather evidence. Jessica had given me her passwords, claiming she had nothing to hide, but what I found in her archived messages changed everything I thought I knew about her situation. Hidden among hundreds of spam emails and old correspondence, I discovered that Jessica had been maintaining a secret savings account that Derek had never found. The account contained $68,000, money she'd managed to hide from Derek during the 8 months they'd been together. The discovery hit me like a physical blow. Jessica had been aware of this hidden money throughout her entire desperate return to our family. She'd watched our parents struggle with medical bills and face eviction while sitting on resources that could have solved their immediate problems. Her tearful pleas for protection and support had been performed while she had more cash available than our parents had seen since selling their house. When I confronted Jessica about the hidden account, her initial response was denial, followed by a series of increasingly desperate excuses. First, she claimed she'd forgotten about the money and the trauma of escaping from Derek. Then she insisted it was emergency money that she needed to keep hidden in case Derek found her. Finally, she admitted that she'd been planning to take the baby and disappear again once she was physically recovered from childbirth. "You don't understand," she said, tears streaming down her face as her carefully constructed victim narrative crumbled. "Derek will never stop looking for me. I need that money to start over somewhere he can't find me. If I give it to Mom and Dad now, I'll have nothing left when I need to run again." The casual way she discussed abandoning our parents again, leaving them with nothing after using their mobile home as a safe house for her pregnancy, revealed that Jessica's fundamental character hadn't changed despite everything she'd experienced. She was still the same selfish person who'd taken their inheritance and disappeared, now using Derek's threats as justification for another round of abandonment and betrayal. Frank and Carol were in the kitchen during this confrontation, and I could see through the thin walls that they were listening to every word. The look on my father's face as he realized Jessica was planning to leave them again was heartbreaking. A combination of devastation and recognition that the daughter he'd favored for decades was truly lost to them. But Jessica's deception went even deeper than the hidden money. As I continued searching her digital records, I discovered evidence that she'd been researching Derek's background months before his supposed betrayal of her became apparent. She'd known about his previous relationships and their suspicious patterns, but she'd believed she could manipulate him just as effectively as he was manipulating her. Email exchanges between Jessica and her college friends revealed that she'd actually been proud of Derek's criminal sophistication, viewing it as evidence of his intelligence and resourcefulness. She'd bragged about his ability to play the system and had even suggested to friends that she was learning valuable lessons about financial manipulation that could benefit her in the future. The emails painted a picture of someone who'd willingly participated in Derek's schemes, believing she could outsmart him and emerge with both his criminal expertise and her family's money. Her portrayal of herself as an innocent victim was a calculated performance designed to regain our family's sympathy and support while maintaining access to her hidden resources. Most damning was an email draft she'd never sent, written just days before Derek's final escalation into violence. In it, she'd outlined her own plan to disappear with their unborn child and Derek's criminal contacts, believing she could establish her own version of his operation targeting wealthy men instead of women. The draft revealed that Jessica's transformation wasn't the result of Derek's abuse. It was the natural evolution of someone who'd always been willing to exploit others for personal gain. Derek hadn't corrupted her. He'd simply provided her with more sophisticated tools for the selfishness that had characterized her behavior throughout her life. Agent Morrison arrived that evening to review the evidence I'd gathered, and her assessment of Jessica's character was far harsher than I'd expected from a federal investigator. "This changes the entire dynamic of our case," Agent Morrison said after reviewing Jessica's emails and financial records. "She wasn't just a victim, she was attempting to become a partner in Derek's criminal organization. Her pregnancy and return home appear to be part of a backup plan to access additional family resources while maintaining her connection to Derek's network. The implications for our family were devastating. Jessica hadn't returned because she'd escaped from Derek. She'd returned because her partnership with him had failed, and she needed our resources to finance her next scheme. The hidden money was meant to fund her disappearance with our grandchild, cutting off all contact just as she'd done after receiving her inheritance. Frank suffered what appeared to be a minor heart episode that evening, his blood pressure spiking as he processed the full scope of Jessica's deception. Carol spent the night monitoring his condition, while I sat up making phone calls to arrange for enhanced medical care and legal protections for my parents. By morning, I'd made a decision that would define the rest of our family relationships. Jessica's pattern of manipulation and abandonment was going to end permanently. I was going to make sure she could never again exploit our parents' love and generosity, and that the grandchild she was carrying would grow up with healthy family relationships, rather than being used as a tool for ongoing extortion. The war for our family's future was about to begin, and this time, I was going to make sure the right side won. I spent the next morning making phone calls that would change our family's situation forever. The first call was to Agent Morrison, informing her that I was prepared to cooperate fully with the federal investigation and help coordinate Derek's capture. The second call was to a family law attorney in Cedar Falls who specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial exploitation by relatives. Agent Morrison arrived at noon with a detailed plan for using Jessica's phone and the hidden bank account as bait to draw Derek into federal custody. The operation would require Jessica's cooperation, but I'd already decided that her participation wouldn't be voluntary if she refused to help. Derek expects to hear from Jessica within the next 2 weeks, Agent Morrison explained. He's calculated that the approaching due date will make your family desperate enough to pay whatever he demands for the baby's safety. We want to use that expectation against him. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jessica would contact Derek claiming that our family had pooled resources to create a substantial fund for the baby's future. She would offer to meet him at a predetermined location with $50,000 in cash, supposedly representing just the first payment of ongoing support our family was prepared to provide. Derek's arrogance and greed made him predictable. According to Agent Morrison's psychological profile, he would be unable to resist the opportunity to collect a large payment while re-establishing control over Jessica and access to our family's resources. His military training would make him cautious, but his financial desperation would override his security concerns. We'll have agents positioned at multiple points around the meeting location, Agent Morrison continued. Derek won't be able to approach without being observed, and the moment he attempts to collect the money, we'll have him on federal charges of extortion and wire fraud. Jessica initially refused to participate in the operation, claiming that Derek's threats against the baby made cooperation too dangerous. But when I informed her that I'd discovered her hidden bank account and was prepared to reveal her deception to our parents, her resistance crumbled quickly. "You can't tell them about the money," Jessica pleaded. "It would destroy them to know I was planning to leave again. They're already so fragile, and Dad's heart can't handle much more stress." "Then, you're going to help us put Derek away permanently," I replied. "And afterward, we're going to have a conversation about your responsibilities to this family and your daughter." The meeting with Derek was scheduled for a truck stop parking lot 30 miles outside Cedar Falls, a location that provided federal agents with clear sight lines and multiple approach routes. Jessica would arrive alone, apparently carrying $50,000 in a briefcase, while I waited nearby in my car as backup, in case the situation deteriorated. The operation went exactly as Agent Morrison had predicted. Derek arrived in a stolen pickup truck, conducted a brief surveillance sweep of the parking lot, then approached Jessica with the confidence of someone who'd successfully run this type of scam dozens of times before. Watching him through binoculars from my concealed position, I could see the predatory calculation in Derek's movements. He wasn't just collecting money. He was reasserting dominance over Jessica and establishing the terms for ongoing exploitation of our family. Everything about his posture and expression suggested that he viewed this meeting as the beginning of a long-term relationship rather than a simple financial transaction. But Derek's arrogance had made him sloppy. Federal agents moved in the moment he touched the briefcase, surrounding him with overwhelming force before he could react or attempt to flee. His arrest was swift and professional, with agents seizing multiple phones, weapons, and detailed records of his various criminal enterprises. The evidence found on Derek's person exceeded even Agent Morrison's expectations. He was carrying detailed files on all 7 of his current victims, including photographs of their families, financial records, and psychological profiles designed to maximize the money he could extract from each situation. Most damning was a ledger showing his projected income from each victim over the next 5 years, treating their children as permanent sources of revenue through ongoing threats and manipulation. With Derek in custody and his operation dismantled, I was finally free to address the real problem facing our family: Jessica's continuing pattern of manipulation and her plan to abandon our parents again. That evening, I arranged for what I told my parents would be a celebration dinner to mark Derek's arrest and our family's return to safety. Agent Morrison attended the dinner as a witness officially there to brief us on Derek's charges and the timeline for his prosecution. But her real purpose was to document Jessica's response when I revealed the truth about her hidden money and her planned abandonment of our family. Before we celebrate Derek's arrest, I announced placing printed records of Jessica's secret bank account on the small kitchen table. There's something everyone needs to know about Jessica's real plans for our family. The explosion that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. Frank collapsed back into his chair, his face turning gray, as he processed the implications of Jessica's deception. Carol began screaming at Jessica, calling her a monster and a liar who had been willing to watch her parents die in poverty while hoarding money for herself. Jessica's initial response was to deny everything, claiming I'd fabricated the evidence to turn our parents against her. When that failed, she tried to justify her behavior by insisting that the hidden money was necessary for her and the baby's survival. Finally, she resorted to blaming our parents for creating the situation through their favoritism and poor financial planning. You gave me all that responsibility when I was too young to handle it. Jessica screamed at Frank and Carol. You ruined my life by making me your retirement plan, and now you want to ruin my daughter's life too. The accusation that our parents had somehow victimized Jessica by giving her their life savings was so outrageous that even Agent Morrison looked shocked. Here was a woman who'd received nearly $500,000 in unearned inheritance, squandered it on a criminal boyfriend, planned to abandon her family again, and was somehow claiming that she was the injured party in the situation. Frank suffered what appeared to be a heart attack during the confrontation, requiring emergency paramedic attention that brought our neighborhood gathering to an abrupt end. As ambulance workers stabilized his condition and prepared him for transport to the hospital, I made an announcement that would reshape our family forever. The $68,000 Jessica has been hiding is going into a trust account for Mom and Dad's medical care and housing. I declared addressing both Jessica and Agent Morrison. I've already contacted a lawyer to set up legal protections that will prevent Jessica from accessing any future family resources without oversight. Jessica's response was to threaten legal action, claiming that the hidden money was her property and that I had no right to control it. But Agent Morrison pointed out that the money had likely been obtained through Derek's criminal activities and was therefore subject to federal seizure as evidence in his prosecution. If you want to maintain any relationship with your daughter and your family, I told Jessica as the paramedics prepared to transport Frank to the hospital, it will be on terms that protect everyone from your selfish decisions. You're not going to abandon your parents again, and you're not going to use your daughter as a tool for manipulation. The power dynamics in our family had shifted permanently. For the first time in 30 years, I was the one making decisions and setting boundaries, while Jessica was forced to accept conditions rather than dictate terms. Frank and Carol were finally seeing their golden child's true character, and the favoritism that had defined our family relationships was coming to an end. As I followed the ambulance to the hospital, I realized that Derek's arrest was only the beginning of the justice our family needed. The real work of healing and rebuilding would require confronting decades of dysfunction and establishing new relationships based on mutual respect rather than blind favoritism. 6 months later, I stood in the comfortable living room of my parents' new apartment in Sunset Manor, a well-maintained senior living community that offered both independent living and access to medical care when needed. Frank was reading the newspaper in his favorite recliner, which we'd managed to save from their old furniture, while Carol worked on a crossword puzzle at a table by the window that overlooked a landscaped garden. The transformation in their living situation was dramatic and complete. Using Jessica's hidden $68,000 combined with my own savings and a reverse mortgage loan I'd helped them secure, we'd been able to provide them with comfortable housing, comprehensive medical coverage, and the dignity they deserved in their golden years. Frank's diabetes was now properly managed with the help of an on-site medical staff that monitored his blood sugar levels and adjusted his insulin as needed. Carol's arthritis was being treated with physical therapy and medication that Medicare covered when administered through the Senior Living Facilities Health Program. For the first time in years, they weren't rationing medications or skipping doctor appointments due to cost concerns. Jessica had given birth to Emma 3 months earlier, a healthy baby girl who brought joy to our family despite the circumstances surrounding her conception. Derek was serving a 15-year federal sentence after pleading guilty to charges of wire fraud, identity theft, extortion, and kidnapping across multiple states. The other women he'd victimized had received partial restitution from assets seized during his arrest, and his entire criminal organization had been dismantled. The changes in Jessica herself were the most remarkable part of our family's transformation. She now lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment 30 minutes from Sunset Manor, working as a receptionist at Cedar Falls Pediatric Associates and attending court-ordered parenting classes and financial management counseling twice a week. The transition hadn't been easy for any of us. Jessica had initially resisted the boundaries I'd established, threatening to move away and take Emma with her, rather than accept oversight of her financial decisions. But the family court judge who reviewed our case had been impressed by the detailed documentation I'd provided about Jessica's history of financial irresponsibility and abandonment of family obligations. Under the terms of a court-supervised agreement, Jessica's access to Emma was conditional upon her maintaining stable employment, attending counseling sessions, and participating in regular family meetings where her progress was reviewed. She could relocate only with court approval and was required to provide detailed financial accounting for any expenditures related to Emma's care. The most significant change was in Frank and Carol's attitude toward their children. Through family counseling sessions that I'd arranged and paid for, they'd begun to understand how their decades of favoritism had damaged both of their children and created the dysfunctional family dynamics that led to our crisis. I spent 30 years thinking that love meant giving Jessica everything she wanted, Frank admitted during one of our weekly family dinners at Sunset Manor. I didn't realize that real love means teaching your children to be responsible and considerate of others. Carol had been even more direct in acknowledging their mistakes. We treated you like you were less important because your achievements weren't as flashy as Jessica's, she told me during a private conversation. But you're the one who saved us when we needed help the most. You're the one who showed us what loyalty and responsibility really look like. The weekly family dinners had become a new tradition that brought structure and accountability to our relationships. Jessica attended with Emma, providing our parents with regular access to their granddaughter, while ensuring that family interactions remained supervised and healthy. During these meals, we discussed practical matters like Emma's development, Jessica's progress in her counseling sessions, and our parents' medical care. But perhaps the most important change was in how our family made decisions. For 30 years, Frank and Carol had made choices based on what would make Jessica happy, often to the detriment of other family members. Now, family decisions were made collectively, with input from all parties and consideration for everyone's needs and limitations. Jessica's participation in these family discussions was limited by her history of poor judgment, but she was gradually earning increased trust through consistent demonstration of responsible behavior. Her job at the pediatric clinic was providing her with both income and exposure to healthy family dynamics, while her counseling sessions were helping her understand the impact of her previous selfish choices. The court-supervised parenting arrangement had also proven beneficial for Emma's development. Rather than being raised by a single mother with a history of poor decision-making, Emma was growing up with the support and stability of an extended family that was committed to her welfare. Frank and Carol had become devoted grandparents who provided emotional support without financial exploitation. My own life had been transformed by the experience of taking responsibility for our family's crisis. I'd discovered leadership abilities I hadn't known I possessed, and for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely valued and respected by my parents. They frequently told friends about my mechanical expertise, my problem-solving skills, and my loyalty during their most difficult period. The changes had also affected my romantic life in unexpected ways. Susan, a registered nurse who worked with Frank's medical team, had been impressed by my dedication to my parents' care and my handling of our family crisis. Our relationship had developed naturally over the months as she observed how I'd transformed our dysfunctional family dynamics into something healthy and sustainable. "You saved your entire family," Susan told me during dinner at a restaurant in Cedar Falls, where we'd become regulars. Not just from Derek's threats, but from the patterns of behavior that created the crisis in the first place. Susan understood the challenges of dealing with complicated family situations through her work with elderly patients and their adult children. Her perspective on healthy family relationships had been invaluable in helping me establish appropriate boundaries with Jessica while maintaining my commitment to my parents' welfare. The legal arrangements I'd established were designed to protect our family from future manipulation, while providing Jessica with opportunities to rebuild trust through consistent, responsible behavior. The trust fund for Frank and Carol's care was structured to provide for their needs regardless of any future family crises, ensuring they would never again face poverty or abandonment in their final years. Jessica's access to family resources remained limited and supervised, but not permanently restricted. If she continued to demonstrate responsible parenting, stable employment, and consideration for others' needs, her role in family decisions would gradually expand. The goal wasn't to punish her indefinitely, but to ensure that her future choices wouldn't again devastate the people who loved her. Emma was thriving in this structured environment, showing early signs of the confidence and security that come from growing up in a stable family system. She had regular contact with loving grandparents, a mother who was learning to prioritize her daughter's needs, and an uncle who was committed to protecting her from the dysfunction that had characterized previous generations. The life lesson that emerged from our family's crisis was both simple and profound. Real love requires boundaries and accountability, not unconditional support. That enables destructive behavior. Frank and Carol's misguided favoritism hadn't helped Jessica develop character or resilience. It had created an entitled person who crumbled when faced with real challenges and responsibility. True family strength comes from mutual respect and shared responsibility, not from protecting one member at the expense of others. The favoritism that had defined our family for decades had ultimately harmed everyone involved, creating resentment in me and a dangerous lack of accountability in Jessica. Now, for the first time in 30 years, our family operated as a team where everyone's contributions were valued and everyone's needs were considered. Frank and Carol had learned that love sometimes means saying no and establishing consequences for irresponsible behavior. Jessica was learning that family membership requires reciprocal care and consideration, not just taking whatever support is offered. I had found peace in my role as family protector and decision maker, a position I'd earned through my actions during our crisis rather than inherited through favoritism. The mechanical problem-solving skills that had seemed less impressive than Jessica's flashy achievements had ultimately proven far more valuable when our family needed real solutions to serious problems. Most importantly, Emma would grow up in a family environment where love was demonstrated through consistent support and appropriate boundaries rather than through unlimited resources and minimal expectations. She would learn that family relationships require effort and consideration from all parties, and that true security comes from being part of a functional team rather than being the center of everyone's attention. As I looked around the dinner table at Sunset Manor that Sunday evening watching Frank play peekaboo with Emma, while Carol showed Jessica pictures from her old photo albums, I realized that we'd accomplished something I'd never thought possible. We'd created a healthy family dynamic based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. The journey had been painful, and the crisis had nearly destroyed us, but we'd emerged stronger and more connected than we'd ever been when our relationships were based on favoritism and unlimited tolerance for selfish behavior. I encourage anyone who's dealing with family favoritism or enabling behaviors to consider whether your love is truly helping the people you care about or whether it might be preventing them from developing the character and skills they need to succeed in life. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is establish boundaries and hold people accountable for their choices. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who were taking advantage of others' generosity? How did you balance love and accountability when someone you cared about was making destructive choices that affected everyone around them? Thank you for following our family's journey from crisis to healing. I hope our experience demonstrates that even the most damaged family relationships can be rebuilt when people are willing to prioritize everyone's well-being over individual comfort. Please like this story if it resonated with you. Subscribe for more real-life experiences about overcoming family challenges. Share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing about healthy boundary setting, and comment below with your own thoughts about balancing family loyalty with personal responsibility. I wish you and your families the strength to build relationships based on mutual respect and the wisdom to know when love requires difficult conversations and meaningful change.